Hi everyone! Welcome to the lecture on fin de siècle and the Decadence movement and Impressionism. This will prepare you for our transition from the 19th to the 20th century. Let's start with fin de siècle. It means end of the century in French, and it was a cultural movement of the 1880s and 1890s. Like a lot of the cultural movements of the time, it began in France and then spread out to the rest of Western and Russian culture. The 1880s and 1890s were a very exciting, turbulent time in Europe and Russia. Huge technological changes were happening, especially the spread of the railroads across all of Europe, Russia, and North America. There were also big changes in medicine and things like the invention of the telegraph, the gramophone, and other ways of recording and transmitting your thoughts and sending them around the world. So life as people knew it was being completely changed. Everyone was aware that there was a huge change in both technology and culture happening, and they reacted to it by seeing it often as a degradation. They felt that current society was degrading, things were going downhill, they were very pessimistic in many ways, but they also had hope for a future better society. An example of the fin de siècle sort of worldview would be Oscar Wilde and his kind of dark humor, his pessimism that was also very funny, his slightly racy subject matter, and his sort of belief that society was changing. Oscar Wilde is also a great example of the fin de siècle movement because he lived his life as if it were also a work of art, something we'll discuss more later. The fin de siècle movement focused on science. They were very impressed with all the scientific advances that were happening, but they were also very interested in personal impressions, the ego. There was a lot of egotism in the sense of being focused on yourself and your own experiences, and there were a lot of what we would now call pseudoscientific subjects. For example, societies were formed to investigate the occult, people held seances, there was interest in sort of real-life vampires. There was just all kinds of stuff going on, some of which we would now call scientific and some of which we would now call pseudoscience. The Decadence, or as we might say in English, Decadence, was an artistic movement that arose in France in the late 19th century as part of the general fin de siècle cultural milieu of the time. As an artistic movement, as you might guess, it focused on decadence or decadent things, and there was a strong focus on things that were disgusting or self-disgust felt by the authors, and it often celebrated the bizarre or perverse. It involved a focus on sexuality that previous 19th century artistic movements had not seen, and there was particular interest in the femme fatale, the fatal woman, the woman who was dangerous because of her beauty. There was also focus on what we would now call BDSM, which became a real interest of decadent artists. As I mentioned in the previous slide, decadent and fin de siècle artists tried to make their lives a work of art along with their actual artistic productions, so they frequently sort of lived out their art through what you might call dangerous liaisons. They frequently had multiple sexual partners, they took drugs, they experimented with bizarre occult ideas, and tried to live in a decadent manner as possible, again, like Oscar Wilde, who is an excellent example of the fin de siècle general cultural movement. The person who was most responsible for bringing the decadence and symbolism, which became interchangeable ideas in Russia, to Russia was the writer Valery Brusev, and he deliberately introduced decadence and symbolism into Russian literature in the 1890s. He released a series of poems and journal articles about it and deliberately tried to start this new artistic movement in Russia. He tried and succeeded. He himself wrote both poetry and prose. His poetry is very interesting formally. He experimented with lots of different formal styles. His prose was also very experimental, and he wrote what we would now call fantasy and science fiction. His works were notable for their aggressive breaking of social taboos, especially sexual taboos. Now, Russian literature was never as buttoned up sexually as, say, English literature, as you might have noticed from reading Dostoevsky. However, Brusev took it to the next level and wrote very explicit poems and prose works about sex, including lots of what we would call BDSM sex. So if you do read his work, which I kind of recommend, be prepared. Even these days, it's pretty wild stuff. For example, in his novel, Ognenny Angel, or The Fiery Angel, it features a threesome in which the female main character tortures herself by cutting her breasts and things like that, and also torments the men around her by having them sleep at the foot of her bed, which is something that appears in a number of Brusev's works, the man being forced to sleep on the floor at the foot of the woman's bed, perhaps watching her having sex with other partners. So, again, be prepared if you ever read Brusev. He himself also lived a very decadent life, involving drug use and love triangles, and so Ognenny Angel has this autobiographical element, even though it's historical fantasy, and the love triangle in it is supposedly based on the love triangle in Brusev's own life. And if you're burning with curiosity to read more about this, I have an article called Object or Abject in Toronto Slavic Quarterly that is freely available online, and the link is in the PowerPoint. Another artistic movement that arose in France in the late 19th century, one you're probably more familiar with, is Impressionism. And it was originally a movement based in the visual arts. It was notable for its focus on ordinary subjects, frequently bourgeois subjects, possibly working class subjects. The painters often painted outdoors, and they would do what was called plein air painting, where they would stand outdoors and paint outdoors. Although their subjects were often realist and painted what we would recognize as real things and regular everyday life, they used very vivid, contrasting colors and painted things in a way that had a sort of unreal or symbolic flavor. They tried to convey the essence of the subject with just a few bold strokes and brightly contrasting colors rather than lots of detail. And so their works are clearly realist, but at the same time, there's something more than realist. Impressionism was considered to be largely a movement in the visual arts, but it also had its literary counterpart, and Chekhov is often considered to be one of the main Impressionist writers of the period. Like the Impressionist painters, he focused largely on everyday, ordinary subjects, frequently with a focus on the bourgeois. His works are clearly realist. Unlike, for example, Brusev, he doesn't do what we would now call fantasy or science fiction. He's very much focused on the real world and everyday life. At the same time, his works are different from 19th century realist works. They have a lot less detail. So he didn't write any long novels. If we think of the major realist works of the 19th century, we think of huge, long novels like War and Peace, or especially Anna Karenina. Chekhov wrote plays, short stories, and a couple of novellas, and he used these sort of realist techniques, or focused on the real world in any case, but he used the Impressionist technique of having a few telling details that were highly saturated with meaning. So he basically did these kind of Impressionist sketches of his stories rather than lengthy, detailed narratives. If you're interested in reading more about Chekhov, and we'll discuss Chekhov at greater length in a different lecture, but if you're interested in reading more about Chekhov, I recommend Dew on the Grass by Radislav Lapushin. Disclaimer, Dr. Lapushin was my advisor and I helped with the book, so I have a personal interest in it. But I do think that it's an excellent book on Chekhov if you would like to read more about Chekhov and his literary techniques. So that's it. Please read and enjoy Chekhov.